All right, as we stay with this story, right, let's just bring up some of what took place in court today as far as the decision of the court is concerned. Remember that it was a split decision with two judges, being in the majority, granting that interim interdict and also putting the hearings on hold, but also a minority interdicting, in fact, opposing the interdict, right, and saying that the review itself lacks prospects of success. And there's also a lot of talk even about these particular two judgments, with the minority one and the majority ones, especially when you delve deeper into some of the, the reasons there that are being given, especially when you think about even that issue of harm. We'll talk about that in just a moment with the analysts at this stage. But also recapping, right, when you look at the timeline, the farm, the PHALA farm that is, the burglary happened in February 2020, and 4 months later in June, we then of course then continue then to see in fact not even 4 months later in 2022, this is in June, we then see Arthur Fraser laying that complaint, raising a lot of concerns and questions to say why now. You'd remember the timing of it also coming into sharp focus because we know that the burglary happened in 2020, and then at the same time we then see that particular panel, the composition of it, a 3-member panel in Parliament being led by the retired Justice Ngobo, and finding that the President has a prima facie case to answer. And it's important to note that that work of that panel came into sharp focus as well as far as the work of the arguments of this interdict are concerned. The fact that it had 30 days and the evidence that it considered before it. And you'd remember the President has been saying that he actually views that report as flawed, and saying that when it comes to evidence, it relied on hearsay in part among some of his argument. And then in May, you saw the Constitutional Court sending it back to the National Assembly, speaking about how Parliament needed to deal with its own processes because it could not just simply put this matter to vote. Then you look at, just this particular ruling on the interdict itself. So why did the judges agree? For example, the majority argue that the harm to the President would be irreparable, and that the review deserves a full hearing. And when they speak about the issue of harm and how irreparable it will be, they say that yes, while there is protection for him as far as some of the rules are concerned, but there will be a stain. One of the rulings actually says that there will be a stain on the President regardless of what would have, been the outcome. And you'd remember even in the arguments itself, the lawyers representing the committee were saying that he may as well be exonerated. So what harm would there be? But you then have seen what became of the judgments here in this particular matter, and also saying that Parliament should simply, in fact, the minority saying that Parliament should proceed. Parliament should proceed, that the report remains valid until such a time that it is set aside. That is the minority judgment here. So a lot of focus on these two judgments as well, in fact 3 if one can even put it that way, and the majority one of course prevailing that the interdict is granted. So what happens now, right? The hearings remain paused, but also at the same time you're then looking at now the review that we are all waiting to hear in September when it finally sits, to see then which way does all of this go. But also at the same time, will the President appeal if he's not happy with the outcome of the review? How much time will that be? Because then it means if he appeals, and also if it depends when we get the ruling, what does it mean then for the work of Parliament? So a lot of questions tonight to try and understand exactly what is going on here, because ultimately this story has an impact both legally and politically as well.